A black woman, Lila, is pulled over for no reason by the police at the airport while picking up her sister. The situation escalates to a tense standstill, and only when her husband, a detective, arrives does the situation de-escalate. But the story doesn't end there. It unearths a web of secrets and discrimination within the police force. Part 1. Flashing lights at the airport. Do you trust your instincts? I do, and that gut feeling has saved me from a lot of trouble. But once, it signaled a real nightmare, right at the place where everything should be orderly and safe, the airport. This story is about a day I went to pick up my sister, about nosy cops, and about a secret my husband had been keeping. Until everything unraveled. Lila adjusted the collar of her thin denim jacket, glancing at herself in the rearview mirror. Okay, everything was fine. She was on her way to pick up Dara, her sister, who had been texting nonstop, saying she landed earlier than expected. The blazing sunlight reflected off the long row of windshields in the arrivals area, and the hum of passengers echoed in the air. Lila drove a short distance from her suburban home to the bustling terminal, sure that this was just another mundane errand before she returned to a busy workday. Normally, she wasn't the worrying type. She believed in order and fairness. She trusted that most people, even the police, acted with good intentions and followed the rules. But as soon as she passed the airport security checkpoint, an uneasy feeling gnawed at her chest. It's probably just the traffic, she told herself. After all, the airport was full of watchful eyes, long lines of security personnel, and a general sense of tension. But maybe it's not just that, a fleeting thought crossed her mind. Lila had no reason to suspect that simply pulling up at the arrivals curb would attract so much scrutiny. She was a 32-year-old data analyst, the wife of a respected police detective, and the mother of 2 energetic boys who were in preschool that morning, completely unaware of the drama about to unfold in their mother's life. Her phone buzzed again, and she glanced at the screen. Dara was out of baggage claim. Lila quickly texted her back, saying she was 3 minutes away, and that traffic around the terminal was heavier than usual. No matter how many times Lila had picked someone up from that airport, she was always amazed at how familiar roads could turn into an obstacle course. Pedestrians darted out unexpectedly, rushing across lanes, while cars surged forward, horns blaring, creating a chaotic soundtrack that made everyone tense. She flicked on her turn signal and maneuvered into a spot at the curb, scanning the crowd for Dara's familiar face. She had no intention of staying longer than necessary. She knew the airport rules. Linger too long, and security would escort you away. But as she waited, seatbelt still on, she noticed a swirl of dark uniforms behind her. 2 police officers had stepped out of a nearby patrol car, and a quiet alarm rang in her mind. That's odd, she thought. You don't usually see uniformed cops here, just airport security. She tried to dismiss her discomfort, but couldn't help glancing in the rearview mirror. They seemed to be looking in her direction with particular interest. Instead of assuming the worst, she told herself they were probably just monitoring traffic, making sure cars didn't idle too long. I'll be out of here in less than 5 minutes. Nothing to worry about, she reassured herself. Yet, a tight knot of anxiety still twisted in her stomach. Dara emerged from the sliding glass doors, waving to catch Lila's attention. Her sister was a tall woman in her late 20s, with a particular love for stylish scarves and an air of confidence in everything she did. Dara carried her phone in one hand and a large coffee in the other, clearly juggling too many things with a charming clumsiness that defined her. As she approached, she called out, "Lila, inside was a nightmare. The customs line was endless. I'm so exhausted. I just wanted off that plane." Lila smiled, tilting her cheek so Dara could give her a quick peck. "I'm parked tight, we need to go right away," she said. She noticed the 2 officers moving toward them with purpose. A strange, tense knot formed in her throat, but she tried not to let Dara see her concern. "What the hell?" Dara muttered, taking a satisfied sip of her coffee. "Are we seriously getting stopped already?" Lila took a slow, deep breath. "They're probably just checking paperwork," she replied. But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. There was no such thing as a random document check when you were pulled aside at the airport for no apparent reason. Both women got into the car, Dara casually sipping her coffee while Lila prepared to pull away. Then, red and blue lights flashed behind them. Lila's heart skipped a beat. She glanced in the mirror, same two officers, now shining flashlights, despite it being the middle of the day. It felt absurd, out of place. Is this about us? Dara asked, shifting uncomfortably. You didn't even do anything. Lila inhaled slowly. They're probably just checking paperwork, she repeated, though even she didn't believe it anymore. There was no such thing as a routine document check when you were being stopped at an airport for no apparent reason. She flicked on her hazard lights and rolled down the window, the tension in her chest rising with every step the officers took toward her car. One of the officers, an older man with graying mustache, approached the driver's side. His name tag read Officer Garza. The other officer, younger and more rigid in stance, was Officer Daniels. Lila realized this was real, not just a passing wave of suspicion or standard procedure. Officer Garza didn't waste time. Ma'am, I need to see your driver's license and vehicle registration, he said. Of course, officer, Lila replied, keeping her voice calm. Can you tell me why I was pulled over? She reached into the glove compartment, retrieving her documents while holding onto her license. Garza's gaze flickered to Dara, then back to Lila. We're conducting random checks on vehicles idling too long in the restricted zone, he said, his tone making Lila uneasy. Her blood simmered. I understand, but this is the arrivals curb. I just pulled up to pick up my sister. I've only been here for a minute or two, she responded. Garza nodded slightly but remained silent for a beat. He took her documents and handed them to Officer Daniels, who began writing something in a small notepad. Dara stared straight ahead, her face tense with quiet defiance, and Lila felt a wave of frustration build beneath her composed exterior. Is this your vehicle, ma'am? Officer Garza asked, a hint of skepticism in his voice. Lila forced a tight smile. Yes, officer. My name is Lila Morgan. Officer Garza nodded to his partner, and both of them seemed determined to drag this moment out. Lila's mind raced. Her registration was valid. Her insurance was up to date. She had done nothing wrong. A silent question hovered in the air. Why were they really bothering her? Officer Daniel spoke in a lower voice, glancing at Lila's driver's license. Is the address on this correct? Yes, it is, Lila replied, looking him in the eye. She didn't waver. Beneath her composure, her thoughts swirled. She had seen enough scenarios unfold in public places to suspect that there might be a deeper reason for this. Lila was African American, and she had experienced subtle forms of discrimination throughout her life. She remembered the incidents when she was followed in high-end stores or overlooked for certain job opportunities until her credentials became undeniable. Now, sitting in her car with nothing out of place, she couldn't help but feel like she was being singled out, even though the officers hadn't given a direct reason to say so. Dara tapped her foot anxiously. Can we hurry this along, officer? She asked. Our mother is expecting us at home, and we haven't broken any rules. Lila gently placed her hand on Dara's arm to calm her down. The last thing they needed was an escalation. She knew how quickly things could get bad. She had seen it happen to acquaintances and in viral videos online. She also knew that the best course of action was to remain respectful and comply with requests to avoid any miscommunication. Officer Garza cleared his throat. We don't need commentary, miss, he said, turning to Dara. Then he looked at Lila and added, just remain patient while we verify your information. This is standard procedure. Lila pressed her lips together but nodded anyway. Of course. Time seemed to drag as Officer Daniels disappeared to run the information while Officer Garza remained by the driver's window. Lila glanced in her side mirror. She noticed passers-by, travelers from all walks of life, whisking by, pulling suitcases on wheels, preoccupied with their own journeys. It was humiliating to be stopped like this with no explanation other than a vague mention of random checks. She squeezed the steering wheel, doing her best to keep her composure. Dara kept stealing glances at Lila, probably wondering how her older sister could remain so calm. Dara never hid her emotions well. She was the outspoken activist in the family, the one who had participated in peaceful protests, written opinion pieces on social justice, and passionately argued at the dinner table about fairness and equity in society. Lila had always leaned more pragmatic, but she supported Dara's beliefs. Now, forced into silence in front of these officers, she felt as if their shared beliefs in fairness were unraveling under the fluorescent glare of the airport. Officer Daniels returned, handing the documents back to Officer Garza, who glanced quickly at Lila. Lila released a slow breath, hoping this meant she could simply drive away, but instead of returning her papers with a polite, "Have a good day," Officer Garza cleared his throat again and said, "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle, ma'am." Lila froze. She fought the sudden urge to respond with shock. "Step out? Why?" she asked, unable to keep the tremble from her voice. Officer Garza's mustache twitched. "I need to ask you a few questions, and it's easier if we talk outside the car." Lila and Dara exchanged a worried glance. There was no reason for any additional questioning. What were they fishing for? Lila forced herself to remain calm. Arguing wouldn't help. If she complied, there would be no excuse for them to escalate further. She unbuckled her seatbelt, opened the door, and slowly climbed out. Dara started to follow, but Officer Daniels gave her a pointed look. "Stay in the car, miss." An uneasy swirl rose in Lila's chest. This was becoming stranger by the second. The statement from Officer Daniels made it sound as if Dara was a threat or had done something suspicious, which was completely unfounded. Lila glanced back at her sister, giving her a look that urged her to stay calm. Dara pressed her lips together, arms folded, clearly burning with frustration. Standing outside in the bustling arrival zone, Lila felt every set of eyes passing them. She tried to steady herself, telling herself that in worst-case scenarios, she would call her husband. Anthony Morgan was a dedicated detective with the local police force. He was widely respected, but he had also encountered friction in the department when he challenged certain traditions he felt were discriminatory. Lila had always admired him for being unafraid to stand his ground. While she considered calling him at that very moment, she also recognized that he was in the middle of an important assignment that day. She did not want to disturb him unless absolutely necessary. Officer Garza led her away from her car, closer to the rear of the patrol vehicle. He paused and folded his arms. "Your record is clean," he acknowledged, "but we received a call about suspicious behavior involving a vehicle matching your description." Lila's brows knitted in confusion. What suspicious behavior? The mention of a call seemed ridiculous. She had only just arrived at the airport. A sense of unreality washed over her. "I haven't done anything other than wait for my sister." Officer Garza's eyes narrowed fractionally, a hesitation crossing his face. "We were informed to be on the lookout for a dark-colored sedan that was loitering in unauthorized zones." Lila's mind raced. There were dozens of dark-colored sedans on any given day. "Officer, I just pulled in. How could I be loitering?" Officer Daniels stepped forward, his tone curt. "Ma'am, keep your voice down." His gaze flickered, taking in Lila's posture. "We need to verify some details. Where are you headed? Where did you come from?" Lila forced composure into her voice. "I came from my home, about half an hour away. I'm picking up my sister who arrived on an early flight from overseas. Then we're going home." Officer Garza and Officer Daniels exchanged glances. The tension between them was palpable. Lila felt like they were testing her, perhaps waiting for an inconsistency or for her to show fear. But her life was straightforward. She had no arrests, no warrants, not even a traffic ticket in the last decade. All of this was baffling. After a long, tense pause, Officer Garza handed her documents back to her. "We will allow you to proceed shortly," he said, "but we have some further questions for your passenger as well." Lila's heartbeat hammered in her chest. "Further questions?" Officer Daniels walked up to the passenger door, motioning for Dara to roll down the window. Dara complied but folded her arms, eyes blazing with indignation. Lila could only watch from a short distance, uncertain how to intervene. She wanted to remain calm, but her patience was wearing thin. The situation was escalating without explanation. Dara spoke up, her voice carrying to where Lila stood. "Is there a problem, officer?" Officer Daniels stooped slightly to peer through the window. "We just need to confirm your identity as well, miss. If you have identification, please present it." Dara let out a small annoyed laugh but gave him her ID anyway. "I haven't done anything wrong." Officer Daniels studied Dara's ID, asked a series of routine questions. Where she lived, what flight she'd come in on, and wrote it all down. As the seconds stretched on, Lila's phone buzzed in her back pocket. A wave of relief mingled with guilt as she saw it was Anthony calling her back. She had sent him a hurried text earlier explaining she was being pulled over. She hadn't expected such a quick response. Stepping away from the officers, she took the call. "Anthony, I'm at the airport and 2 cops just pulled me over. They're asking a ton of questions. His voice bristled with concern. What do they want? Lila lowered her voice, glancing toward the officers. They're claiming they got a tip about a suspicious dark-colored sedan. They're questioning me and Dara separately. She paused, swallowing her frustration. I've never seen either of these officers before. Anthony exhaled audibly. I'm on my way. Where exactly are you? Terminal B, arrival's curb, she replied, relief fighting with her racing heartbeat. I don't know what else they want. I'll be there as soon as I can, he said. Stay calm and don't do anything that could escalate the situation. As she ended the call, she heard Officer Garza's voice behind her. Who are you talking to? Lila turned around, feeling her temper flare at his tone. My husband. He's a detective. A momentary flicker crossed the officer's face, something between surprise and unease, though he tried to conceal it. We just need a few more details and you'll be free to go, he said, but his voice wasn't nearly as confident as before. Dara stepped out of the car despite Officer Daniels telling her to stay inside. She turned to face Officer Garza. Is this profiling? Because I'm starting to feel like we're being targeted. We're literally doing nothing but existing at an airport curb. Officer Daniels opened his mouth as if to scold Dara, but he closed it quickly when he saw Officer Garza's expression shift with caution. Tension weighed on the air. Foot traffic continued around them, a few curious onlookers pausing, but most people hustling onward, too caught up in their own travel itineraries. Lila placed a gentle hand on Dara's arm again, trying to maintain a semblance of calm. She knew her sister's outrage was justified, but it wasn't going to improve the situation. Dara, let's just wait. Anthony is coming. Officer Daniels jerked his head in Lila's direction. You said your husband is a detective. Which precinct? Lila lifted her chin. District 11. A flicker of surprise crossed both officers' features. District 11 was known for its stringent leadership and for being progressive. Word had spread that certain older officers from other precincts resented District 11's new reforms aimed at addressing internal biases. Lila watched them closely, searching their faces for any sign of an internal reaction. She wasn't looking to exploit the system, but she knew Anthony had told her stories about friction within the force. Officer Garza broke the ensuing silence first. We're just doing our jobs. If your husband is a detective, we trust he'll understand that. Dara shook her head in disbelief. You don't seem to be doing your jobs properly. Maybe we'll see what Detective Anthony Morgan thinks about that. Lila's insides twisted with anxiety. She wanted Dara to stop talking back, but at the same time, she felt a desperate sense of vindication. She too was tired of this unwarranted scrutiny. Yet she also knew how quickly such encounters could spiral. The memory of various news headlines flitted through her mind. She swallowed hard, praying that Anthony would show up soon before anything got out of hand. A tense 2 minutes passed with Officer Garza making a call on his radio, presumably double-checking their story. The way he kept glancing at Lila and Dara indicated that part of him suspected they were telling the truth. Another part she sensed wanted to prove he had a legitimate reason for the stop, as if to justify his actions. Lila's phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Anthony. He was close, in the parking ramp heading down to the arrivals level. Officer Daniels stood off to the side, posture rigid, hands on his hips, wearing the expression of someone who'd stepped in too far to turn back. Lila had encountered a few officers like that in her life, those who, once they'd started a procedure, insisted on seeing it through to validate their authority regardless of the actual facts. Lila took a deep breath. Officer, do you mind if I wait in my car? My sister is getting cold, she gestured to Dara, who was standing there in a light sweater. Officer Garza hesitated but then nodded grudgingly. Fine, but don't leave. Lila and Dara climbed back into the sedan, shutting the doors behind them. The tension inside the car was like a living thing, expanding in the cramped space. Dara let out a frustrated groan, pressing her head against the headrest. I knew it, she mumbled. I knew they were profiling you the second you pulled up. I saw how they looked at us. Lila grimaced. I don't want to believe that, but it's starting to feel that way. It's not like they found any expired tags or questionable items, just an excuse to hassle us. Dara rubbed the space between her eyes. I was overseas for months, dealing with cultural differences, and yet I come home and can't even leave an airport without feeling singled out. Lila reached for her sister's hand. Let's not let this escalate, okay? Dara nodded slowly, deflating as if the tension had drained out of her. Yeah. In the rearview mirror, Lila spotted Anthony jogging toward them. He was dressed in khaki slacks and a button-down shirt, with his official detective's badge clipped to his belt. He had the look of a man who came prepared to handle anything. When he reached the car, he motioned for her to lower the window. Lila did so, and relief flooded her at the sight of his face. Anthony scanned Lila and Dara, his eyes reflecting anger tempered by professional composure. "You two okay?" he asked. Lila nodded. "We're fine, just aggravated." Officer Garza and Officer Daniels walked up, stepping to either side of Anthony. The shift in their demeanor was almost palpable as they noticed the badge on his belt. They exchanged uncertain looks. Anthony turned to them, his voice measured. "I'm Detective Anthony Morgan, District 11. That's my wife and my sister-in-law you've got pulled over. Can I ask what this is about?" Officer Garza adopted a brusque tone. "We received a call regarding a suspicious vehicle matching this description. We followed procedure and checked it out." Anthony's jaw tensed, but his voice remained calm. "And what was suspicious about my wife picking up her sister at the airport?" Officer Daniels cleared his throat, shifting on his feet. "The call mentioned a woman waiting for someone, possibly surveilling the area." Anthony's eyes narrowed. "Sounds flimsy. And from what I gather, you've been at this for quite a while with nothing to show for it." Officer Garza looked at Officer Daniels, who quickly added, "We were just about finished." Anthony stepped forward, keeping himself between Lila's open window and the officers. "Clearly now, if you have no legitimate cause to hold them further, I'd appreciate it if you'd let them go. I wouldn't want to think this is a case of profiling." Officer Garza's mustache twitched, his face displaying reluctance. "We're not profiling anyone, Detective. We were acting on the tip we received. We take these calls seriously, as we should." Anthony's tone grew sharper. "As you should, but not to the point of harassment." He paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. "I want your names and badge numbers. I'll make sure District 11 is fully informed of the nature of this stop." A flicker of something crossed Officer Daniels' face, an emotion that might have been fear or regret. He recited his badge number. Officer Garza did the same, though he sounded more defiant. "If you're insinuating we did anything improper, Detective, that's your prerogative," Officer Garza said. "But we reserve the right to conduct these checks." Anthony nodded, taking out a small notepad and scribbling down the details. "I've got your information. My wife is free to go, correct?" Officer Daniels stepped back and lifted his chin in a gesture of grudging acquiescence. "Yes, she's free to go. We have no reason to hold her any longer." Lila slowly exhaled, feeling the knot in her stomach loosen. Dara, from the passenger seat, let out a breathy exclamation of relief. Anthony gave the officers a curt nod, signifying that he considered their discussion over. "Have a good day, officers," he said, his voice tinged with a note that suggested precisely the opposite of well wishes. Lila started the engine, carefully signaled, and pulled away from the curb with Anthony beside her window. He motioned for her to proceed to a nearby parking area where they could regroup properly, away from the prying ears and eyes of passersby. She parked in one of the short-term lots, and they all got out to talk properly, away from the prying ears and eyes of passersby. Dara slammed the car door behind her, running both hands through her hair. "That was ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous," she vented. "I can't believe they tried to hold us there." Lila put her arms around her sister in a tight hug. "I'm just glad it's over." The adrenaline that had surged through her body left her feeling shaky and drained. "Thank you for coming so quickly," she said to Anthony. He dropped a kiss on her forehead. "Are you okay?" She nodded, though her heart was still pounding. "I just feel violated, I guess. We didn't do anything. I'm a law-abiding citizen. It's not fair." Anthony let out a heavy breath, frustration lining his handsome features. "I know it's not fair. I see this too often, and it weighs on me more than I can express." His jaw tightened. "I'm going to file a complaint, even if it doesn't go anywhere. They should know that we know our rights." Dara sighed, placing her hands on her hips. "It's exhausting. Every time you think we've turned a corner, something like this happens. You get singled out for simply existing." Lila's thoughts turned to their mother, who had always warned them about these possibilities. She used to say, "Your father fought in wars for this country, but you still might be treated like an outsider by some folks." Their father was gone now, but his words about standing strong and never letting injustice make you bitter echoed in her mind. Anthony lifted Lila's chin gently, encouraging her to meet his gaze. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "I wish I could have prevented it." She shook her head. "Not your fault. They didn't know who they were messing with." A small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth, trying to lighten the mood. Dara's phone buzzed with a new text message. She glanced at it. "Mom wants to know if we're on the way. I say we head home, grab some comfort food on the drive, and try to salvage the day," Lila said. Anthony nodded. "That's the best plan I've heard." Anthony walked them back to the car and said he'd follow them home to ensure they were okay. As they pulled away from the airport, the residue of anger and fear weighed heavily on Lila's heart. She glanced at Dara, who stared out the window in quiet contemplation, and then at Anthony in the car behind them, matching her speed as if protecting them from anything else that might happen on the road. The drive home was spent in reflective silence, punctuated by a few sighs from Dara. They pulled into their driveway, a modest but welcoming home in a quiet suburb. The grass was neatly trimmed, and their children's toys were arranged near the porch. Usually, that sight brought Lila immediate joy. Today, though, she felt a lingering sense of how easily things could go wrong in an instant. Once inside, the sisters found their mother, Sheila, bustling in the kitchen. She was a strong, capable woman who had raised them to be self-assured and proud. Sheila turned to greet them with relief on her face. "You took a while. Is everything all right?" Lila and Dara exchanged looks and Anthony stepped in. "We ran into some trouble at the airport, but it's settled now." Sheila's expression clouded, a flicker of sadness in her eyes. "They gave you trouble, didn't they?" Lila shrugged off her jacket. "Yeah, but it's over." Dara exhaled, setting her suitcase in the hallway. "You know how it is, Mom, but let's not dive right into it. I could use some tea and a chance to relax." Sheila pursed her lips. "Of course, let me set up the kettle." She gave Dara a comforting pat on the arm. "I'm just glad you both are safe." In the living room, their father's old recliner served as a reminder of the man who'd taught them to stand tall. Dara plopped down on the couch, leaning her head back with exhaustion, while Anthony and Lila quietly followed Sheila into the kitchen to help with the tea. The tension lingered in the air like a heavy fog, but the warmth of home offered some comfort. Anthony's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and frowned. "It's the station," he said under his breath, stepping out of the room to answer it. Lila busied herself with stacking cups and retrieving tea bags, but she could sense her husband's mood shift as he spoke in hushed tones. She wondered if something about the complaint or the earlier incident was already causing ripples. Sheila measured the sugar into a bowl, her motions as precise as ever. "That boy is always working," she mused gently, though pride and concern wove together in her words. Lila nodded. "He can't help himself. He takes it to heart every time something like this happens." They heard Anthony speaking softly in the next room. Dara joined them in the kitchen, eyeing the phone in Anthony's hand as if she too was worried. After a minute or two he returned, slipping the device into his pocket. "They want me in for a briefing," he said flatly. "Seems there's been a recent wave of suspicious calls about vehicles at public sites. The higher-ups think it might be a hoax or some twisted prankster. They want us to crack down." His features hardened in frustration. That could explain the call about a suspicious sedan, but it doesn't excuse how they handled it. Dara frowned. "So they get a tip, and you guys are forced to investigate. I understand that part, but then being so heavy-handed is a separate issue." Anthony nodded. "Yes, and if it's the same pattern, then it's becoming a real problem. Multiple calls, sometimes baseless, turning everyday people into suspects. That's not the public service we signed up for." Sheila finished preparing the tea and set it on a tray, a thoughtful glimmer in her eyes. "Let's have a seat in the living room and take a moment to let the stress pass." They gathered around the coffee table, mugs in hand. Dara recounted her experiences abroad, her volunteer work with an international health organization, the new friends she made, the cultural differences she appreciated. Gradually the tension lifted, laughter slipped in, hugs were exchanged. Still, Lila felt a persistent knot in her stomach, as though the day's events had cast a long shadow on her sense of security. Much later, after Dara and Sheila retreated upstairs so Dara could unpack, Anthony and Lila found themselves alone in the living room. The sun was starting to set, painting the walls in muted gold. Lila curled up on the couch, leaning into Anthony's side, the weight of the day finally catching up with her. He slipped an arm around her shoulders. "I'm sorry," he said gently. "I know I keep saying it, but I mean it. You shouldn't have to deal with this kind of harassment, especially from my fellow officers." She tilted her face up to him, eyes searching his. "I'm just grateful you were there. It shouldn't matter that you're a detective, but the truth is, it changed the situation in an instant." Anthony's jaw tightened. "That part makes me angry, because they should treat everyone with the same respect, whether that person has a badge in the family or not." Lila nodded, feeling her throat constrict. "I know, but it is what it is. I want to move on from it, but my mind keeps going back. Why us? Why that call? And why did they pull me aside like that if they had nothing to go on?" Anthony brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead. "It's not going to be an easy answer, and it might never feel justified. Sometimes people exploit the system, playing on stereotypes. Sometimes officers let their biases guide them, consciously or unconsciously." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But we won't let it break us. We keep pushing for better." Lila squeezed his hand, taking solace in his resolve. She loved him not just because he was a dedicated detective but because he never hesitated to confront wrongs, whether they were within his own department or out in the community. He was that rare breed of officer who believed deeply in reform and bridging divides and showing compassion. Their conversation drifted to the kids who would be coming home from preschool soon. In the midst of the day's turmoil, Lila realized she hadn't called to update the babysitter. She quickly checked her phone, relieved to see no urgent messages. She would talk to her boys that evening, perhaps in gentle terms about what had happened. She wanted them to grow up aware but not afraid. The question of how much to tell them weighed on her. They were only toddlers after all. When the babysitter arrived with the children, the house filled with the sound of little feet and joyful squeals. Corey and Dylan, both with bright smiles, barreled into their parents' arms. For a moment, all the tension melted away as the family reunited in the living room. Dara and Sheila came downstairs, and the entire atmosphere brightened. Later that night, after dinner and bedtime routines, Lila and Anthony found themselves revisiting the topic of the airport stop. He planned to submit a formal complaint in the morning, complete with the badge numbers and the details of the encounter. Lila felt a measure of relief knowing that at least they wouldn't stay silent, but nothing prepared them for the next twist. Around 9 in the evening, a phone call came through Anthony's work cell phone. Lila was reading a book in bed when she noticed the concern on her husband's face. He stepped into the hallway to answer, his voice steady but uneasy. After a couple of minutes, he returned, setting the phone on the bedside table. Lila closed her book. "Is everything okay?" Anthony exhaled slowly. "That was my captain. Turns out the 2 officers who stopped you were in the middle of an internal investigation already. There have been complaints about them pulling over people of color without clear cause." A ripple of shock passed through Lila. "So they have a history?" Anthony nodded grimly. "Yes, apparently so. The captain wants a statement from you. They're building a case and your story could help." He rubbed his hands over his face. "I never wanted you to be in this position." Lila set aside her book. "I'm willing to do it. We can't just let them keep getting away with it." She paused, thinking of the potential backlash, thinking of how it might affect Anthony's standing. "But are you okay with me speaking out?" Anthony's eyes reflected both worry and pride. "Of course I am. The only thing that matters is the truth. You do what you feel is right, and I'll support you." She scooted closer to him, pressing her forehead against his. "We'll do this together, then." He kissed her gently. "Yes, together." Early the next morning, before the kids were awake, Anthony went into work to finalize his paperwork, and Lila prepared to give her statement. Dara insisted on accompanying her to the police station for moral support. They arrived mid-morning, stepping into a place that felt both familiar and foreign to Lila. She had been there a few times to drop off Anthony's lunch or pick him up, but this was different. Now she was there to file an official complaint. A young officer at the reception desk recognized Lila as Detective Morgan's wife and politely guided her to a private conference room. Dara's presence was a steady, comforting force at her side. Soon Anthony's captain, a tall, imposing man named Captain Ruiz, walked in with a subdued expression. "Mrs. Morgan, Miss Morgan," he greeted them politely, shaking their hands. "I'm sorry for the circumstances that brought you here. Detective Morgan is busy for a moment, but he'll join us soon. In the meantime, I want to assure you that we take these matters seriously. Lila pressed her lips together and nodded. Thank you, Captain. I just want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. My sister and I were both very shaken. Dara crossed her arms. I don't care that they're being investigated. What matters is that people stop getting harassed. It shouldn't take an internal investigation for real action. Captain Ruiz's gaze flickered with understanding. We're trying to address it now. Let's proceed. He invited Lila and Dara to sit. Another man walked in, introducing himself as an internal affairs investigator, Detective Chung. They briefly exchanged pleasantries, and then the interview began. Lila described every detail: how she parked at the airport, how the officers approached, how they asked her to step out, questioned Dara, and withheld any clear reason for the stop until they mentioned that vague